The shares got crunched due to weaker than expected profit guidance. CSL's the third largest company on the stock market,
and it's facing quite a bit of fresh competition coming through in Europe.
I lost so much weight so fast that I was like, oh my God, this is magic. This is amazing.
One of the world's biggest biotech companies is based right here in Melbourne, and it's been ticking on for more than a century. In the decade before the pandemic, it delivered a 750% return for investors. But for the last 5 years or so, it's barely grown. Hello, I'm Rebecca Jones and welcome to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. Today on the show, CSL. It's an Australian company that right now has a market cap of more than $130 billion. But recently, the shine has come off. Amy Bainbridge writes about Australia's biggest investment managers for Bloomberg, and Jason Gale writes about health. They're both here with me today to discuss their latest collaboration into how this massive company is keeping its blood flowing and what things like next-generation weight loss drugs might mean for business in the years ahead. Amy, let me start with you. Now, CSL isn't a household name the way some other Aussie-listed companies are, and, look, it doesn't hit the headlines every week, does it? In 30 seconds or less, can you tell me what CSL does?
I'll do that as fast as I can, Beck. Look, it is now the third largest company in the ASX. It sits behind CBA and BHP, yet the company itself will say it's usually the biggest name that nobody has ever actually heard. In fact, John Levy, a veteran of the company, said that they are not fans of hubris and they're quite happy to be flying under the radar. It makes medicines that treat haemophilia, immune deficiencies, it makes flu vaccines and products for iron deficiency and kidney care. And plasma and everything you can make from it is really their biggest business. They collect in huge markets like the US, Europe and China. It's hugely diverse and it's known really as a classic growth stock that gains over time.
We don't really talk that much about plasma, do we, in our data, unless you're talking about TVs, right?
That's right, Beck. It's not something that people talk about on a daily basis, and the company is very aware of that. They don't have that big profile.
So with that said, Amy, what has inspired you and Jason to take a closer look under the hood of CSL?
Well, part of my job here at Bloomberg is not just to interview investment managers, but it's to show what the biggest super funds in Australia are invested in. And CSL is a bit of a superannuation shop, if you like. If you look through the top shareholders, some of our biggest superannuation funds are pretty significant shareholders in the company. Jason and I, we're both based here in Melbourne. We looked at what crossover we have on our beats, and we came to realise that this is actually a really interesting story. A lot of the super funds don't talk about individual stocks, but some investors did speak to me on and off the record. And there's also, on top of that, some really interesting themes playing out globally in healthcare, like weight loss drugs, which we can talk about later. And we kind of wondered what that might mean for some Australian companies. So we decided to look at why it's performed so well over the years, but also what's happening now and what's the future. And it's not just impacting super funds and therefore all Australians. CSL's been a real hit with mum and dad investors as well.
I think this is a good time to bring in Jason to the conversation. Jason, you've covered the global healthcare industry for decades for Bloomberg. You've got a master's degree in health security, a book coming out on the COVID-19 pandemic. So I kind of feel like you're probably the best person in Australia to take me through just a very brief potted history of how CSL has become such a shareholder darling. And, really with the benefit of hindsight as we have, when their most recent raft of challenges has really started.
Well, just to take you back, CSL began in 1916, back when World War I was impeding access to drugs from overseas. The Australian government wanted to do something about it, so it created the Commonwealth Serum Laboratories. It was run as a government department for generations, but that all changed when Brian McNamee, an entrepreneurial young doctor, was brought in to shake things up, and he did. He went after the plasma business. He bought some of the most iconic businesses in health in the world. We're talking about businesses founded by the Swiss Red Cross and German Nobel laureate Emil von Behring, the father of serum therapy. And CSL became the world's biggest maker of plasma-based medicines. And these, as you heard earlier, these help stop bleeding, treat burns patients. They also include immunoglobulin, and it's a rich soup of antibodies and other immune proteins used to treat a wide range of immune conditions, like the stiff person syndrome that singer Celine Dion has. So this business has been going gangbusters, well, at least it had been until the pandemic hit. COVID made it difficult to get plasma. It was hard to get people into the collection centres, and it was hard to staff these centres. And that really highlighted CSL's reliance on plasma and the need to diversify, which brings us to Vifor. That's a Swiss.
What's that?
That's a Swiss company that CSL bought back in 2022 for $11.7 billion US. And there's a huge unmet need for the iron-based treatments for Vifor that Vifor makes, but the business hasn't produced the return CSL was looking for.
Right. So I see the shares have basically plateaued for going on 5 years, which obviously includes the pandemic and the Vifor acquisition you've just mentioned. Jason, you and Amy interviewed both the CEO, Paul McKenzie, and Brian McNamee, the chairman of CSL. What did they have to say about how they're tracking?
So Vifor generates a lot of cash, but so far the margins and the profits have been slim. McKenzie and McNamee say they didn't expect Vifor's top-selling product, Ferinject, to be encountering so much pressure from generic competition, especially in Europe, at least so soon. But they're committed to the business and they see real avenues for growth. And they make a strong argument. The World Health Organization estimates that close to 2 billion people worldwide are anemic, and most of them are lacking in iron because of it. Women of reproductive age are, of course, at risk, but increasingly researchers are finding that iron supplementation has other benefits. When you give it to patients before surgery, for example, they need a lot less blood transfusions, which carries its own risks. And when you give it to heart failure patients with iron deficiency, you keep them out of the hospital longer, and that has a huge economic saving. Doctors I spoke with for the story say it's likely that iron supplementation could offer similar benefits in patients with kidney disease, for example.
So it could actually prevent some of these diseases progressing if the treatments are given to them early enough? Is that how it works?
I think the bottom line is that we keep finding other advantages of topping up people's iron levels in ways that we weren't really even expecting.
And that is the bread and butter of Vifor, right? It's this the focus on iron deficiency and also kidney disease, which continues to be a massive, massive public health issue. And Amy, I'm interested to hear from you here. How has the investment managers that you talk to responded to this position from CSL, which is obviously to play a bit of the long game here?
I've spoken to probably half a dozen institutional investors, hedge fund managers. There are questions around Vifor, how much they paid, certainly. But one person I spoke to, Junbei Liu from Tribeca Investments, she's still there at the moment, she said, look, if the purchase itself made strategic sense, although it hasn't performed so far, there does seem to be confidence that, you know, in the long term it will generate money for the business. It is important to note, though, while, you know, there's big institutional investors, hedge funds invested in CSL, there's also a lot of what we call mum and dad investors as well. And the Australian Shareholders Association represents thousands of those kinds of investors. And they asked some questions about the remuneration report for executives at the latest annual general meeting at the end of October. And it amounted to what's called a first strike against the company. So that's the rejection of the remuneration report. You have to get 25% or more of votes against the remuneration report to get a first strike. For CSL this year, it was just over 26%, so not by a huge margin. But the important thing is that if that happens again next year, that there could be a motion to spill the board. So the real questions were around the pay packet of Paul McKenzie. CSL has said that they're operating in a global marketplace and that's how it's measured. But Brian McNamee, the chair, also said, look, it's not the first strike they've ever had. You know, they've had these first strikes before, if that makes sense. But they are going to go away and think about what is it? Is it that shareholders are unhappy with the pay, or is it actually in relation to some other issues as well. They need to dig a bit deeper, but they've gone at lengths to say that they are listening to their shareholder base.
And they've got almost a year to the next AGM, right, to do something about that. But by and large, like in general terms, there does seem to be at least some alignment, despite the stagnation of their share price, with what CSL is saying they believe is the future potential earnings of Vifor to what the investors are saying as well. Like they're not willing to abandon it just yet, because there are, as Jason mentioned, there's a lot of things that they just don't know what they can do with some of these technologies yet.
Yeah, that's right. They say that there's still a good pipeline for the future, future projects. CSL does a huge amount of research and development that is part of what makes it unique. And over the years, it's been seen as a growth stock, growing over time. And the investors that I've spoken to are staying the course. They're not pulling money out, and they think that Vifor will perform in coming years, and that it makes strategic sense as well because of the access to the European market. But there's no doubt that there has been some disappointment more recently that share price is kind of stagnated, it's moved sideways. And McNamee and McKenzie have both said, look, Vifor will be making us money in the next few years, and we've got a plan to execute that. They've also made the point that Vifor's helped them get access to Europe for other products as well, which is an interesting sort of take that they've tried to communicate to shareholders.
And after the break, we'll have a look at what other headwinds are lurking for CSL, including the rise of so-called miracle weight loss drugs and a new Secretary of Health in the White House.
I just looked at the news reports. People like you, Bobby. Don't get too popular, Bobby. You've reached about the level. Now, we want you to come up with things and ideas and what you've been talking about for a long time.
And welcome back to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. You're with me, Rebecca Jones, and my two guests today, Amy Bainbridge and Jason Gale, who are also my colleagues here in Bloomberg's Melbourne bureau. Now, President-elect Donald Trump has said he's tapping prominent skeptic Robert F. Kennedy Jr., otherwise known as RFK Jr., to lead the Department of Health and Human Services. Investors who were previously excited about the changes to the pharmaceutical and healthcare industry that Donald Trump may bring aren't so sure now. Amy, the US is CSL's largest market. Why is this potential appointment causing uncertainty in the biopharma space?
I think it's the same as everything being uncertain globally at the moment, and what it's all going to mean. And of course, the appointment of RFK, or the prospective appointment, throws yet another unknown into the mix. But I did speak to CSL around the time. It was just after the election, and RFK was the name at the top of the list and was then, confirmed the next day. Brian McNamee, the chair of CSL, said, look, the US is going to remain our biggest market for the next 20 years, regardless of a change in administration. He said, the FDA is the preeminent regulator of drugs worldwide, and he really said, look, calm down. This is not going to be a big deal. He also made some interesting observations around, RFK being in that role. He said, look, do I think that necessarily everyone got things right during the pandemic? He said, I lived in Melbourne. We all know what that was like, okay? It wasn't a great experience. So you shouldn't not be able to have a conversation about how things work and how things were done at the time. But he said, look, he has no significant concern that their life-saving drugs or life-saving vaccines will be impacted by the change in the administration. That said, if you looked at the share price since the election, it has bounced around a little bit. And I think that's symptomatic more broadly of concerns, not just about CSL, but what impact it's going to have on the wider sector.
Jason, let's zoom in now on what's coming next for the future of healthcare. I understand there's been a fair bit of talk recently about the global expansion in next-generation weight loss drugs and how that could be a worry for CSL. Can you walk me through what the concerns could be there?
So we're really talking about these so-called GLP-1 receptor agonists, which include Ozempic and Mounjaro, as well as Wegovy, as you just mentioned. CSL sees these drugs as a competitive threat, just another one. It's true that research is showing that they have a unique ability to reduce risk for diabetes, cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, even certain cancers and psychiatric illness. But still, access issues are limiting people's ability to take these medicines and therefore benefit from these remarkable health effects. In any case, age is a major driver of kidney disease, and these drugs can't turn back the years.
Right. And I know that part of your day-to-day, you speak to a lot of medical doctors as opposed to Amy is talking to PhDs of people with finance backgrounds. What are the doctors telling you in terms of potential decline in demand for some of these, say, the kidney, the dialysis-based products for the younger generation? Are we still some way away from a significant shift happening there?
There is a real hope that doctors that I've talked to articulate around getting these drugs out to those who need them and for them to ameliorate the health impacts of obesity. But we're not seeing that at a population level yet, and may not for many years.
So, Jason, we know that since the start of 2020, the stock has plateaued for the longest period since CSL's listing. They've diversified with Vifor, and that hasn't been a plug-and-play solution. Running alongside all of this, we've had changes happening in both politics and culture. What is the key takeaway here in terms of how we keep track of companies like CSL who aren't going to be in the headlines every day, but are just so massive? What have you found through your reporting about what could be coming down the pipeline for them?
Yeah, so immunoglobulin, as I mentioned before, it's this remarkable elixir that is being shown to do wonderful things for a lot of diseases we don't know very much about. One of them is, for example, long COVID, and CSL has begun a trial investigating whether their subcutaneous immunoglobulin product can help patients with a specific type of long COVID, one disease, one condition that causes what's known as postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. So we'll find out in the next couple of years whether immunoglobulin can help perhaps a couple of 100 million people with this form of long COVID, which would be remarkable. But ultimately, CSL wants to know whether its iron treatments may be something like a secret sauce that immunoglobulin is. And there are some pretty good suggestions that it might. I was talking to Brendan Nguyen, a very bright nephrologist in Sydney, who is very keen for CSL to take up a study of iron for patients with chronic kidney disease to see if that might have similar benefits to what we see in heart failure, where it's keeping them out of the hospital, keeping them alive longer.
Fascinating, and also a very complicated issue too. Jason, thank you for joining me. Amy, great to have you. And thank you for listening to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. I'm Rebecca Jones. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. It was produced by Paul Allen and edited by Chris Burke and Ainsley Chandler. Don't forget to follow and review the show wherever you get your podcasts and sign up for Bloomberg's free daily newsletter, Australia Briefing. Go to bloomberg.com to subscribe.